The shot came from the gallery. Rosalind heard it before she understood it, a sharp crack splitting through the minuet like a blade through silk, swallowed almost instantly by the swelling noise of the assembly rooms. Most guests heard nothing beyond a pop, a curious sound, something to glance at and forget. But Rosalind had grown up near a blacksmith's forge. She knew the difference between a snapped timber and something deliberate. She also knew where Duke Edmund Caverley was standing. He had positioned himself near the east column, slightly apart from the crowd the way powerful men often did, present enough to be seen, distant enough to remain untouchable. He held a glass of claret he hadn't sipped. His jaw was set in that particular way she had noticed over 4 months of service to his household, not arrogance exactly, but a kind of permanent bracing, as though he expected the world to strike him and had decided long ago not to flinch. Rosalind moved without thinking. Later, she would not be able to explain it cleanly. There was no noble calculation. No moment of heroic resolve. There was only the trajectory her eyes traced from the gallery angle to the column, and her body was already crossing the floor before her mind had finished the thought. The second shot, the real one, aimed, came as she stepped in front of him. It caught her left shoulder. She heard Edmund's sharp intake of breath before she felt the pain. Then the pain arrived, enormous and clarifying, and she gripped the column to keep from falling. The room erupted. Glass shattered somewhere. A woman screamed. Edmund caught her before she reached the floor. "Who are you?" he said, though he knew exactly who she was. She almost laughed. They moved her to a private room off the main corridor. The assembly rooms had a small parlor reserved for moments of aristocratic inconvenience, fainting spells, heated arguments, the occasional gentleman who had drunk himself into philosophical collapse. Now it held Rosalind Voss, seated upright in a brocade chair with her shoulder wrapped in linen that was already darkening at the edge, and Duke Edmund Caverley standing 6 feet away watching her with an expression she could not read. The physician had come and gone. The ball had passed cleanly through the outer flesh, painful, the doctor said, but not life-threatening, provided infection was kept at bay. He had said this to Edmund, not to Rosalind, which she noted with tired amusement. "You should be lying down," Edmund said. "I am perfectly capable of sitting." "That is not what I asked." She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. He had a soldier's directness, she had observed that from the beginning. He did not ornament his words or soften his meaning. In 4 months of serving as companion to his elderly aunt, Lady Harriet Caverley, Rosalind had exchanged perhaps 30 sentences with the Duke directly. He was not unkind. He was simply elsewhere, even when present. "Did you see where the shot originated?" he asked. "The East Gallery. Second alcove from the left." He was quiet for a moment. "You identified that before you moved?" It was not a question. She didn't answer it. Edmund crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out onto the lamplit street where carriages still moved in ignorant procession. His hands were clasped behind him, and she noticed they were not entirely steady. "You stepped in front of me deliberately," he said. "I stepped in the only available direction." "Rosalind." He said her name without title, without ceremony, and the plainness of it surprised her into silence. He turned from the window. "I have been in 3 military engagements. I know what a person looks like when they are stepping out of the way, and I know what they look like when they are stepping in front of something. You were not avoiding anything." She said nothing. He pulled a chair across the rug and sat directly before her, closer than propriety permitted, close enough that she could see the tension working in his jaw. "Who did you see?" he said quietly. "Before you moved." "Who were you looking at?" Rosalind looked down at her wrapped shoulder. At the darkening linen. At her own hands folded neatly in her lap. "No one," she said. "I saw no one." Edmund studied her face for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the door. "I don't believe you," he said, and left. The household on Royal Crescent was quieter than usual the following morning. Rosalind had expected questions, from Lady Harriet at minimum, whose sharp mind operated independently of her frail body. Instead she found breakfast laid, her usual chair pulled out, and the old woman watching her with the particular stillness of someone who had already formed their conclusions and was simply waiting for confirmation. "He came to my room at midnight," Lady Harriet said, pouring her own tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "Asked me everything about you. Your history. Your family. How you came to be in my employment." Rosalind set down her fork. "I hope you told him the truth." "I told him you were the most capable woman I had employed in 30 years and that if he frightened you into leaving I would make his life considerably unpleasant." She sipped her tea. "He didn't seem frightened by that." "He doesn't seem frightened by much." "No." Lady Harriet studied her over the rim of the cup. "Neither, it appears, do you." Rosalind returned to her breakfast and said nothing further on the subject. But upstairs, she knew, Edmund was not resting. She had heard him before dawn, boots on the corridor floor, the low exchange of voices near the study, the particular creak of the third stair that she had learned to avoid in her first week. He had sent for someone. She didn't know who. She found out by accident, 3 hours later. She had gone to the library for Lady Harriet's reading volume and paused at the sound of voices behind the study door, not eavesdropping, simply present, her hand raised to knock, the conversation reaching her before she could announce herself. The trajectory is confirmed. A man's voice she didn't recognize. Careful. Professional. Whoever fired was positioned and waiting. This was not opportunistic. "The guest list," Edmund said. "I've cross-referenced it. 47 names. Of those, 11 had gallery access confirmed by the attendants. Of those 11, a pause. Papers shifting. 3 had reason to be in Bath this week that I cannot yet account for. And the other 8? Accounted for. Families. Business. 2 are women." Silence. Then Edmund said something that made Rosalind's hand drop from the door entirely. "Pull everything connected to the Caverley Estate Trust. Disbursements. Correspondence. Any instruction issued under my signature in the last 18 months. Another pause, harder edged. Particularly anything I don't remember signing." Rosalind stepped back from the door. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the book pressed against her chest, her shoulder aching beneath its bandaging. She had said nothing last night because she was not certain. Because certainty without evidence was simply accusation, and she knew better than most what happened to women of her station who accused lords of things they could not prove. But Edmund was already pulling at the same thread she had been afraid to touch. And somewhere beneath her caution, something shifted, not relief exactly, but the faint, cautious loosening of a fear she had carried alone since the moment the shot was fired. She returned to Lady Harriet's room and said nothing. But that evening, for the first time, she locked her bedroom door. The document arrived on the 4th day. Edmund said nothing at breakfast. Said nothing at lunch. But at 3:30, when the afternoon light was cutting long and pale across the drawing-room floor, he appeared in the doorway where Rosalind sat reading aloud to Lady Harriet and said, simply, "A moment, Miss Voss. When you are able." Lady Harriet waved her off without looking up from her embroidery. "Go. I am not an invalid." Edmund's study smelled of leather and old paper and something faintly medicinal that she suspected had more to do with sleepless nights than any physical ailment. He closed the door behind her, crossed to the desk, and placed a single sheet of paper on the surface facing her direction. She approached and looked at it. It was a letter of financial instruction. Authorizing the withdrawal of £4,000 from the Caverley Estate Trust, directed to an unnamed third party through a solicitor's office in Bristol. The handwriting was precise and confident. The signature at the bottom read, Edmund R. Caverley. She looked up. "I did not write that," he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, not anger, something colder and more controlled than anger. I have never in my life authorized a withdrawal without my own solicitor present and countersigned. That is a rule I established before I left for the continent and have not deviated from once. When is it dated? 8 months ago. While I was still in Portugal. He sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk. Someone has been using my name, my seal, and an exceptionally accurate forgery of my hand to move money I knew nothing about. Rosalind looked at the letter again. At the signature. At the deliberate, rehearsed quality of it, close enough to pass a quick inspection, precise enough to suggest practice. How much in total? She asked. Across 6 documents I have found so far, nearly £19,000. The room was very quiet. Edmund. She used his name without thinking, the way he had used hers, and neither of them acknowledged it. The night of the assembly rooms. Before the shot, I saw someone on the gallery. I told you I saw no one. I know. I lied. He looked at her steadily. I know that too. She pulled the chair across from the desk and sat down, the same gesture he had made in the parlor 4 nights ago, that same deliberate closing of distance. Lord Greymont, she said quietly. He was standing at the second alcove. I know his profile. I have seen him at Lady Harriet's table twice this winter. When I heard the shot and looked up, he was already moving away from the railing. Not startled. Not looking toward the noise the way everyone else did. She paused. He was already leaving. Edmund did not speak for a long moment. He is my co-trustee, he said finally. On the estate. He has signatory access to request disbursements, but not to authorize them unilaterally. For that he would need my signature. Or a convincing copy of it. Edmund looked at the forged letter on the desk between them. That was the moment everything changed, he said, almost to himself, quietly, as though he had been waiting for the pieces to complete a shape he already feared. He stood. Moved to the window. The street below was ordinary and indifferent, people moving through their afternoon without knowledge of any of it. He wasn't only stealing from the estate, Edmund said. He needed me dead before I came home and noticed. Lord Silas Greymont arrived uninvited on the 5th morning. Rosalind was crossing the entrance hall when the butler opened the door and there he was, tall, immaculately dressed, carrying the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere. He was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, with a smile that arrived slightly before any genuine warmth could follow it. She had always found his eyes difficult. They assessed rather than looked. He saw her and the smile adjusted almost imperceptibly. Miss Voss, he said pleasantly. I heard about your unfortunate accident at the assembly rooms. Remarkably brave of you. It was not an accident, she said. A beat. The smile held perfectly. Quite so. A terrible business. I trust you are recovering. Edmund appeared at the top of the staircase. Whatever Greymont had expected from that entrance, concern perhaps, or the relief of a man grateful to see family, he did not receive it. Edmund descended the stairs with the unhurried steadiness she had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. Not cold. Simply completely still inside. Silas, he said. Come in. They went to the study. Rosalind was not invited. She returned to Lady Harriet's room and sat by the window and watched the street below, where Greymont's carriage waited with his driver and a second man she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, positioned with the specific alertness of someone paid to watch rather than drive. Lady Harriet appeared beside her without sound, the way old women sometimes moved in their own homes. He has come to measure the situation, Lady Harriet said quietly. He has come to see how much Edmund knows. Yes. She was silent a moment. Silas was always the cleverest of the Caverley relations. And the most patient. He waited 20 years for Edmund to make a mistake significant enough to exploit. She paused. He simply grew tired of waiting. Downstairs, the study door remained closed for 40 minutes. When Graymont emerged, Rosalind was in the corridor, ostensibly carrying a volume back to the library, unhurriedly, with complete innocence. He passed her without speaking this time. The pleasantness had been packed away. His face in passing was simply careful, and she understood then that whatever Edmund had said or not said, Graymont was now recalibrating. He knew something had changed. Edmund found her in the library 10 minutes later. He came to confess nothing and confirm everything, he said. He sat in that chair and performed concern for 20 minutes, and I watched his eyes move to the desk 3 times. He was looking for the document. Did he see it? It was not there to be seen. Edmund looked at her directly. I need you to do something that I have no right to ask. Rosalind closed the book in her hands. Outside, Graymont's carriage was already pulling away from the crescent, moving at an unhurried pace down the hill. Ask it anyway, she said. The plan was straightforward. That was what made it dangerous. Edmund had contacted his own solicitor, not the firm connected to the estate trust, but a private man named Carew who had served his father and whose discretion Edmund trusted absolutely. Carew had quietly approached the Bristol solicitor's office through an intermediary, requesting copies of all instructions received bearing the Caverley seal in the past 2 years. Standard procedure, framed as an internal estate audit. Nothing alarming. What they needed was Rosalind. Graymont had a private secretary, a thin, nervous man named Potts, who processed correspondence and kept ledgers and had, according to Edmund's investigator, recently begun drinking heavily at a particular tavern near Pulteney Bridge every Tuesday and Thursday evening. A man carrying the weight of what he knew. He won't speak to Edmund, Rosalind said, when the plan was laid before her at the library table. He won't speak to anyone connected to the dukedom. The moment he recognizes authority he will close entirely. Which is why it cannot be me, Edmund said. But a woman asking careful questions over a shared table. She understood. Someone unthreatening. Someone with no visible stake. I will not pretend the risk is small, Edmund said. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the soldier's guardedness, not the duke's distance. Something more undefended than either. If Graymont has any surveillance on Potts, and he may, then being seen in conversation with him connects you directly. I am already connected directly, Rosalind said. I took a bullet meant for you. I suspect Lord Graymont has not forgotten that. Edmund was quiet. I will be careful, she said. She was. Tuesday evening she entered the tavern near Pulteney Bridge in her plainest dress with a borrowed cloak and the manner of a woman waiting for a sister who would not arrive. She sat 2 tables from Potts and ordered tea she did not drink, and opened a letter she had already read and simply existed quietly in his peripheral vision for 30 minutes. It was Potts who spoke first. You've been at that letter long enough to have memorized it, he said. He was already on his 3rd drink. His eyes were not unkind, only exhausted in the specific way of men who had made a single wrong decision and spent years inside the consequences. It's difficult news, Rosalind said simply. He nodded at that with the recognition of someone familiar with difficult news. And somehow, in the way of taverns and evening and the particular loneliness of carrying secrets, the conversation moved, carefully, slowly, naturally, from difficult news in general to difficult positions, to situations a person found themselves in without entirely choosing them. She never mentioned Edmund. Never mentioned Graymont by name. But 40 minutes later Potts looked into his glass and said quietly, if a person knew that a signature had been copied, practiced, over months, from letters kept deliberately for that purpose, and that person had seen it done and said nothing, what would happen to that person, do you think, if it came to light? Rosalind kept her voice completely even. That would depend, she said, entirely on whether that person came forward willingly, or was found. Potts set down his glass. He looked at her properly for the first time. And in his expression she saw it, not defiance, not refusal, but the unmistakable loosening of a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for precisely this moment. For someone to make the choice feel survivable. Tell me where to be, he said quietly. And when? Rosalind folded her unread letter and placed it in her pocket. But walking back along Pulteney Bridge in the cold evening air, she did not feel triumphant. Because she had noticed, leaving the tavern, a figure across the street who turned away a fraction too deliberately, and she had seen that particular coat before, on the man positioned beside Greymont's carriage 5 days ago. She had been seen. She did not go back to Royal Crescent directly. She took 3 unnecessary turns through side streets, doubled back once along a lamplit lane, and arrived at the servants' entrance 12 minutes later than she should have. Edmund was waiting in the kitchen, not the study, not the drawing room, the kitchen, sitting at the plain wooden table with his coat still on, which told her everything about how the last 2 hours had felt for him. He stood the moment she entered. "You were followed," he said. "Yes." Something moved across his face, controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. "I should not have asked this of you." "You asked." I agreed. "Those are different things." She sat down at the table and pressed her fingers briefly against her shoulder where the aching had returned with the cold. "Potts will come forward. He needs immunity from prosecution, and a letter from your solicitor confirming his cooperation will be recorded formally. Give him that and he will provide written testimony about the forgeries, dates, method, and direct instruction from Greymont." Edmund sat back down slowly. "And the man who followed you?" "Greymont knows I spoke to Potts. He doesn't know what was said, but he will move quickly now. Whatever you intend to do, Edmund, it must happen before he reaches Potts first." Edmund nodded once. Then he placed something on the table between them, a folded document she recognized as the original forged letter, alongside 3 additional pages she hadn't seen before. "Caro came through this afternoon. 6 more documents from Bristol. Enough to demonstrate a consistent pattern of fraud extending across 14 months. He paused. "Combined with Potts' testimony, it is sufficient for a magistrate." Greymont was arrested the following morning. He came to the door of his lodgings in his dressing gown, composed until the moment Edmund stepped forward from behind the magistrate and their eyes met, and then the composure dissolved into something uglier and more honest. He said things in that doorway that confirmed, more than any document, exactly the quality of his feeling toward the dukedom he had spent 2 decades expecting to inherit. The legal proceedings lasted 6 weeks. Potts testified. The Bristol solicitor, faced with the evidence, cooperated fully. The forged documents were authenticated by 2 independent examiners. Lord Silas Greymont was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder, the last charge confirmed by the hired assassin himself, who declined to hang alone for a lord's ambition. On the morning the verdict was delivered, Edmund came to find Rosalind in the library. She was reading, genuinely reading this time, a novel Lady Harriet had pressed on her with firm insistence, something about the merits of sense over sensibility. She looked up when he entered, and he stood in the doorway for a moment in the particular way of a man who had prepared words and found them suddenly insufficient. "I owe you more than I know how to properly express," he said finally. "You owe me nothing. Rosalind." He crossed the room and sat beside her, not across from her this time, beside her, which was different in a way that required no explanation. "I have spent 10 years being cautious with everything that mattered to me. Property. Position. What remained of my family." He paused. "I was not cautious with you. I asked too much and offered too little, and you stepped in front of a bullet for a man who hadn't even learned yet what you were worth." She looked at him steadily. "You learned." "I did." He took her hand from her lap with a directness that was entirely characteristic, no performance, no ceremony, simply the decision made and enacted. "I would very much like to keep learning. If you are willing." Outside the library window, Bath continued its indifferent morning, carriages and vendors and the ordinary commerce of a city that had no idea what had been unraveled within its polished streets. Lady Harriet could be heard somewhere down the corridor, issuing instructions to someone who would not be listened to. Rosalind looked down at her hand in his. At the bandaging finally removed, the shoulder finally healing. At 4 months of careful distance now simply gone, replaced by something quieter and more permanent. "I am willing," she said. Lady Harriet appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds later, took one comprehensive look at the situation, and withdrew without a word, though Rosalind distinctly heard, retreating down the corridor, the small satisfied sound of a woman who had arranged rather more than she had admitted to. What would you have done in her place? Stayed silent to stay safe, or spoken up and risked everything?